Well, bless you all. Thank you all for being here today. This is great. We're continuing our study. That phone going off reminds me of something that I've been saying all this weekend, that, the reason that we're here is for one another, not to do everything perfectly. And, I'm excited that we're able to get back together. Let's see where we're at here. Oh, why am I in Ephesians? My bookmark is way off. All right, I believe we are at Genesis 19. Am I correct on this? Anybody? Judgment pronounced on Sodom. No, we're halfway through 18. So Genesis 18, and we're going to pick up at 16, verse 16. Genesis chapter 18, verse 16. And to kind of recap where we left off, a son has been promised to Abraham and Sarah. Abraham is now named Abraham, not Abram. He had an encounter with God where God gave him a change in name. God also spoke to him of a change in name for his wife, Sarai, and promised that they would have a son, even though they were way up there in age. Something that even at 42, I can't imagine having another child. So, in there, well, Sarah was in her 80s. That's truly a miracle, to say the least. And I don't know if do you guys remember hearing a story? There is an actress in South America who was pregnant in her 70s. And it was a big deal in the news just a few years ago. So, somehow it can be possible, especially when God is involved. So, but let's read on from verse 16. And Mary at Christie House, are you able to unmute yourself? Can you see where it is on the?
Oh, absolutely.
There you go. If you would like to read from 16, do me a favor and read from 16, let's say to. Let's read from 16 to 25.
Okay.
And then stop, because it would be a good place to stop. It's a pretty long chapter, so let's just kind of arbitrarily give ourselves a pause to sort out what's going on here. So 16 to 25.
Through 25, so not through 25. Okay.
Yeah.
Then the men set out from there, and they looked toward Sodom, and Abraham went with them to set them on their way.
May I pause you for a moment?
Sure.
Just to catch everyone up. Abraham, thank you for this, reminds me of where we're at. Abraham had an encounter with three men who tradition holds were angelic beings, quite possibly some sort of Christophany, some sort of display of the triune God had come down to greet Abram at his tent. And I don't know if you guys remember, Abram sent out for a lamb to be slain and prepared for them. Sarah made some cakes, and then the men proclaimed, "Your name will now be Abraham, not Abram, and Sarah's name will be Sarah, not Sarai, and you will have a child born to you." And Sarah laughed, and that's where this happened. So these three men are now setting off to a different place. So I'm sorry to interrupt you, Mary. Let's keep going.
I appreciate that interruption. Then the men set out from there, and they looked toward Sodom, and Abraham went with them to set them on their way. The Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Seeing that Abraham shall become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall bless themselves by him? No, for I have chosen him that he may charge his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has promised." what he has promised him. Then the Lord said, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grave, I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry which has come to me, and if not, I will know. So the men turned from there and went toward Sodom, but Abraham stood before the Lord. Then Abraham drew near and said, wilt thou indeed destroy the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Wilt thou then destroy the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it? Far be it from thee to do such a thing, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be it from thee. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? And the Lord said, if I find at Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I will spare the whole place for their sake. Abraham answered, behold, I have taken upon myself to speak to the Lord, I who am but dust and ashes. Suppose 5 of the 50 righteous are lacking. Wilt thou destroy the whole city for lack of 5? And he said, I will not destroy it if I find 45 there. Again, he spoke to him and said, suppose 40 are found there. And he answered, and I think I've gone over, haven't I? This is
It's all right. It's all right. It's going well.
Okay, because I'm in a different Bible than usual. So, and
it's okay.
Apparently it's a parallax Bible.
It's okay. We can finish the chapter.
Okay. So from 29, again, he spoke to him and said, suppose 40 are found there. He answered him, for the sake of 40, I will not do it. Then he said, oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak. Suppose 30 are found there. He answered, I will not do it. But if I find 30 there, he said, behold, I have taken upon myself to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 are found there. He answered, for the sake of 20, I will not destroy it. Then he said, oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak again, but this once. Suppose 10 are found there. He answered, for the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. And the Lord went his way when he had finished speaking to Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place.
So the 3 men, either speaking on behalf of the Lord or as anthropomorphic vision of the Lord himself, spoke to Abraham and said that they were going to judge Sodom and Gomorrah. And they were going to go visit and take a look and see if there were any righteous people there. And if not, and if the place was filled with wickedness, then they were going to destroy it. And Abraham begins this bargaining pattern with God, which almost feels kind of like Peter Falk in Columbo. He keeps coming back with just one more question, and there's this back and forth about, well, what if there's 50 people there? Well, God says, if there's 50 righteous people there, no, I will spare it. Well, if there are 40 righteous people there, and it keeps going back and forth in this pattern. Something that I draw from that is that not that the Lord is to be bargained with, but the Lord is reasonable. And that's a big departure from maybe the vision that you would get of God from the story of Noah. That God laid waste to everyone indiscriminately. He was fed up with humanity, and there's no mercy in play. We see something quite different here. We see a God that can be spoken to, a God that can be, you can plead to the Lord for mercy and find a living well there, ready to give. So, Mary Lee.
So one of the reactions I had to that passage was it reminded me of the story of Diogenes, who would carry a lamp around Athens looking into the faces of people to look for an honest man. And Diogenes was famous for being a social critic. He didn't like the culture of Athens, which he thought was material and power hungry, etc. And so similarly, God is critical of the culture that he's seeing, and he's at least through this human interpretation, cynical about the possibility of finding one redeemable soul. Diogenes, eventually, he was known, he lived as a mendicant, and poverty was what he thought was virtuous. And he was eventually captured by pirates and sold into slavery. But he was someone who, at his time, was a bit of a prophet. He tried to show what he thought was terrible. So he lived, I think, 4th or 5th century BC. I looked up, who knows? But whether just this whole idea of that this was a person with a different God, but someone that was looking for virtue, and it's a parallel to what was going on with the Israeli people, of God saying, this is no good, something's got to change.
It's important to also remember we're coming at this from a hermeneutical, scholarly frame, right? And so one of the things that we laid out is that the intention of the author, whoever the author may have been, tradition holds that it's Moses, is to point to the Jewish people as being set apart, right? So we're looking at this story, and there's something that's not happening righteously within the people who claim the faith in that place, right? We know that Lot, we remember there was this kind of internecine battles going on between these tribal warlords, and we know that Lot wound up taking himself and his people away from Abraham and going to find land to graze his animals where there wouldn't be a squabble with Abraham. He got caught up in all of that stuff, and he's out there in this place, right? And Lot is still someone who's professed the faith. It's maybe even appropriate to assume probably held the ritual of having been circumcised and all of that. He is a part of this tribe, but he's in a different place. And so there's this thing of, well, what does it mean when you have this faith and you're in a place that does not share your faith? And so, if anything, this story is to point toward this notion that you need to be set apart within this place. And you see Abraham bargaining with God and saying, essentially not naming Lot, but essentially saying, what if my cousin is there with his people, and what if, would you judge him along with them? And God is laying out some parameters there. And so I feel like this story has a little bit more to do with that than some of the things that we traditionally get caught up in with this story. But we'll get there. We'll have our chance to talk about everything else. I think we should maybe move on unless someone else has any comment.
I'd like to comment on
Yeah.
On the fact that, differently from Diogenes, Diogenes had that value, but Abraham could talk to his God about it. And you're looking at being in relationship with God as an extreme positive, really, that you have a relationship there. And the second thing I'm noticing is that you're better off in relationship with God, that you're going to end up becoming somehow happier if you can be punished for not living a life of faith. And they're not going to show it as a natural consequence here of, disruptions in family or disruptions in your personal life. And they're going to show the wrath of God in about a minute. But there is a benefit to a God who listens. And that's not something that Diogenes could experience. That's not something that many other cultures experience. The gods were powerful and authoritarian and usually pretty cruel. So I just think it's worth noticing that.
Bill, you're on mute, Bill.
Had a problem with that this morning, haven't I?
Oh, it's all right.
I am following up on what the lady was saying. I found myself reading this and thinking, why in the world is the Lord having this much patience with this mere human who is arguing with him and the nerve to negotiate? And then I think of all the times that I think, Lord, I'm kind of a mess. Why are you having patience with me? But through all of the negotiation that Abraham went through, God knew that there was no doubt whatsoever in Abraham's mind that God could do the judgment. He could destroy the people. And I have to believe that God saw that faith and was willing to negotiate because Abraham was a faithful man.
Amen. Well, many of us are parents. I just had this experience this morning. It was a wonderful, hard lesson. My son, I was asking him to do something he didn't want to do, and he was immediately popping back with a almost teenager-like attitude, just huffing and puffing under his breath. And I just stopped him. I was like, hey, don't you know me? Don't you know I don't like that attitude? And he goes, Dad, I do know you. And I do know that I can tell you that I'm not happy. Which, very emotionally mature of him. And my veiled threat was not enough for him to say, like, I should be comfortable in your presence, and I should be comfortable enough to let you know that even when I don't like it, And the old school dad in me wants to be like, hey, what you feel about what I have to say has nothing to do with what you should be doing, right? But in trying to move along and maintain relationship with my son, I was willing to accept that. And so in that same vein, Abraham had no right to open his mouth about a decision that he had no real purchase in, but had every right as someone in relationship with God, actual relationship with God, to lean in on that relationship and ask the Lord for favor. And I'm willing, as one of Abraham's many sons, as the song puts it, to do quite the same thing. It's quite a blessing. Let's go on. This story's going to get juicy here. Let's do 19. I'll read a bit. Or actually, you know what? No. Why should I do that? We've got our wonderful senior warden here. It'd be a blessing, Kelly, to hear your voice this morning. If you could read as far as you would like into chapter 19, it'd be great for us.
I'd be grateful too. Hi, everyone. Sorry I'm late.
No
I
worries.
appreciate being here. I love being here.
Great having you.
Happy birthday.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rosemary. Thank you, Alvin. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate
Happy
it.
birthday. Wow.
Thank you. I'm just glad to be alive. I'm grateful to be here. Thank you. Alvin, I'm sorry. Is it chapter 19? Genesis?
Chapter 19.
Okay.
Genesis 19.
19. Got it. The two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of Sodom. When
One moment. I'm sorry to jump in once again.
Sure.
Did I miss something? Because there were three angels, am I right? And now we have two?
One was not an angel. One was the Lord.
Right.
That's right. So where'd the Lord go? We don't know. Maybe the story will clarify, but let's continue. I'm noticing this for the first time. I'm sorry.
No.
Kelly, if you...
That was perfect. No apologies. The two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. He said, "Please, my lords, turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you can rise early and go on your way." They said, "No, we will spend the night in the square." But he urged them strongly, so they turned aside to him and entered his house, and he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house, and they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them." Lot went out of the door to the men, shut the door after him, and said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." But they replied, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came here as an alien, and we would play the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." Then they pressed hard against the man Lot and came near the door to break it down. But the men inside reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the door of the house, both small and great, so that they were unable to find the door. Should I go on, or?
So it's a good place to stop.
Okay.
Probably a terrible thing to hear if you were Lot's daughters inside the house at the time. And an incredibly scary story. I've always believed that this had to do with some sort of cultural rituals or customs that were not kosher in its day, to use the euphemism, and certainly aren't kosher now. This notion that perhaps to be a part of a community is to be fully open within your sexual life within that community. We see things like that happen in our world today, cults, other groups that practice such things, and they are, judged within society properly in most cases. But we still see these things happen today. You've heard about that Nixon cult and other such things. And I've always suspected that is what this is about. But scripture is not necessarily clear. One thing that is clear is that, man, that was a crazy place. Poor Lot, is right smack there in the middle of it. There's one distinction that it's the first time I've seen this here. They say to Lot, "You came to us as an alien." There's something suggested there that perhaps Lot was not taking part in all of it, and they accepted that. But now they're telling Lot, no, the deal's off. You're not just going to be able to hang out here and not be a part of our culture fully. But to the thing that we're talking about, as far as reading these things through a hermeneutic lens, there's certainly something there about being set apart within a world that may not understand what your actual approach or background actually happens to be. I don't know. Mary Lee, yeah.
Well, obviously, Lot is offering gifts to these people. There's a subtle exchange occurring in which he wants to remain within their favor, to stay within God's favor, and his daughters are his property and maybe one of his most valued pieces of property. But he's willing to offer up their virginity to these strangers as some incredible gift. But in a cult, at least all the members are consenting individuals, perhaps not the children, but in this case, it's without consent, and it's in that terms of that culture, women and children were property of men.
There's something to note there. You can't do business with everybody. There are some terms that are beyond the pale. Clearly, Lot, in his quest to try and straddle this line of staying righteous before God and relevant enough to do business within this community, sought to make some compromises and cut some corners. There's no going around that. And this is a perfect example of that. He's offering, and it's important to maybe not look at this with our modern eyes, right? Because it's easy for us to look at this the wrong way. But I mean, it's pretty clear, and tradition has always held it pretty clear, that he's offering something extraordinary. He's offering, the first fruits of his family to a community that first of all wasn't even seeking it, and you have to ask, what's his motivation there? Al.
I also think it emphasizes the importance of his guests, that he'd be willing to do this. I think it emphasizes the fact that the people inside the men inside are so revered and important to him that he's willing to do this. And so that's, to me, remarkable.
Michael, what were you?
I've always been sort of taught on this, that the men from the city, or the males from the city, came out, and this was an act of violence and submission to strangers coming in. That Lot's house was kind of not in the city, but at the gate.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that a little hyperbole that all the males in the city came out to them and didn't say, let's go down to the pub and have a beer. But it was a very great act of domination and violence by the local culture on these strangers. And it was a matter of control. But the laws of hospitality within the culture demanded that Lot protect these guests, even above those of his own flesh, his daughters. That the obligation, no matter who these were to a guest. I found it also interesting that supposedly all these males who came out from the city were struck blind.
Yeah.
And that meant Sodom had no seeing males after this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they all were wandered around blindly, which is sometimes overlooked a little bit.
Yeah, and given what's about to occur, you can imagine just what destruction was wrought on people that are struck blind and don't have the ability to even find their way. Mary Lee.
And it also goes with the Oedipus story of Oedipus putting out his own eyes when he realized the sin that he'd committed by laying with his mother. It was that I always thought that was the heart of the Oedipus story, was just his own grief at unknowingly doing something he would never have intended. So blindness, when you've seen your sinful state, I think it's a comparison to the blinding of these men.
We see Bill, yes.
My New King James Version adds in italics, bring them out so that we may know them carnally. This is obviously anathema not only to Lot, but he fell on his face and worshiped them at the gate when he first saw them. He knew they were of God. And they had used the term anthropomorphic form, and I would assume that they were extremely attractive men, and that the whole town, at least that portion of the town, turned out and wanted to know them carnally. I would hope that Lot, we've lived in a Muslim country where hospitality and treating guests is part of the ritual of being a good citizen. But I think Lot probably would have protected anybody that showed up once they were under his house because of tradition. I doubt that he would have offered his daughters, which he did because he realized that his guests were holy and were sent from God.
That's right. That's right. And we see ritualistic sexual violence, unfortunately, in very broken communities and cultures all the time. In fact, here in America, we unfortunately have large places where this happened called prisons, where young men in particular, it's maybe not even about sexual desire within those spaces. It's about setting up hierarchies. And unfortunately, that's a part of our culture that we don't maybe give enough attention and insight to. No one is sentenced to be subject to something like that, but yet we turn our eyes away and we let these things happen, and something that I believe we should be taking a whole lot more serious. And I keep that in mind whenever I become a little judgmental about the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah. That unfortunately there is nothing foreign within the human experience, and there's nothing foreign within the biblical experience. And we have areas of our culture in this world that reflect some of these same tragic values.
I do want to add, if I may, I really appreciate what Bill just said, and I also really appreciate what Michael said about, Michael used the word violence, which is the first time it had been used in any of us speaking. The fact that force is used in these situations is a fact, and we can find that, in our own neighborhoods, there is human trafficking. It's a definite issue in Seattle. I hear incidents about it, and I see the results of it in neighborhoods. So it is not limited to prisons. It's
I'll drive up Aurora
all the time.
Yeah.
And I've worked with people in recovery from family sexual abuse, and there's force, there's violence, there's breaking boundaries, and it's an extremely long process. And it's I don't want to call it epidemic, but it's downright common.
Yeah. Well, to that, the wages of sin often are death, literal or figurative. And we should read what happens to Sodom and Gomorrah here. It's going to get wild. I'll read forward from verse 12, chapter 19, verse 12. Then the men said to Lot, "Have you anyone else here? Sons-in-law, sons, daughters, or anyone you have in the city, bring them out to this place, for we are about to destroy this place, because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it." So Lot went out and said to his sons-in-law, who were to marry his daughters, "Up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city." But he seemed to his sons-in-law to be jesting. When the morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, "Get up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or else you will be consumed in the punishment of the city." But he lingered. So the men seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and left him outside the city. When they had brought them outside, they said, "Flee for your life, and do not look back or stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the hills, or else you will be consumed." And Lot said to them, "Oh no, my lords, your servant has found favor with you, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life, but I cannot flee to the hills, for I fear the disaster will overtake me and I will die. Look, that city is near enough to flee to, and it's the little one. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my life will be saved." He said to him, "Very well, I grant you this favor too, and will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken. Hurry, escape there, for I can do nothing until you arrive there." Therefore, the city was called Zoar. The sun had risen on the earth, when Lot had come to Zoar. So he spent the whole night traveling to Zoar. I'll continue on, verse 24. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord went out from heaven and overthrew these cities, and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities, and what grew on the ground. But Lot's wife behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord, and he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the plain, and saw the smoke of the land going up like the smoke of a furnace. So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the plain, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had settled. It's good to pause there. Horrifying story. It's interesting that Lot still wanted to go to a city, given all of that. So there's something of a cultural break maybe that we can sense between Lot and Abraham. Lot saying, I don't want to go out in the country and die. I don't want to be, left to my own. It's maybe appropriate to assume that Lot lost a lot in the consumption of Sodom and Gomorrah, and wished to go to a place where he could reestablish himself. It's also interesting to me that he did not go back to Abraham, so their rift still exists. Yeah, I don't know. What else did people see there? Mary Lee.
So I thought it was interesting that God was willing to be patient with Lot when Lot was reluctant to leave the city. He saw to it that he did leave the city, and all his wife did was look over her shoulder, and she's turned to dust. Seems way more extreme and unequal justice.
Note that Abraham looked at what was going on there and was not consumed. It's maybe I don't know if it was just as simple as her looking back. It says something that she was behind Lot, and perhaps there's something to she wasn't willing to go. But maybe I'm just reading a lot into it. Maybe it just was literally she looked back. Yeah. Either way.
So, Alvin?
Yeah, Clip, and then
Michael. Yeah. One of the questions I had in this. So the people that left the city were Lot, his wife, and the two daughters. And I had heard at one time that actually 6 people left. It was the 2 sons-in-law, but they thought he was joking. So the question is, was it 4 people or 6 that left the city?
It seems to me to be 4, right?
Okay.
The sons-in-laws thought he was joking. They left that there, and it's not clear. The writers, whoever wrote this text, didn't seem to take as much interest in outlining what happened among the women that were with Lot. But I would assume that if Lot had any men with him, the text might have been a little more clear about that. It seems to me that they were lost in the fire as well. They didn't take it seriously. Michael.
The only, just a small thing here, and I don't know if this is a commonality between early narratives, but the Pillar of Salt story makes me think of another myth in which somebody turned around and lost what they were seeking, and that is Orpheus and Eurydice. He was rescuing her from the underworld, turned around to make sure she was following, and she was taken back into the underworld then.
Yeah.
It was just a little parallel there that struck me.
Yeah.
One other comment that and this is, I don't know what other people will think about this, but this story of the sinfulness of Sodom and Gomorrah, obviously you're speaking about sexual violence and sexual promiscuousness. And of course, at least in my view, that's very, very common today. And I just see that's a real problem in the world today. The promiscuousness leads to obviously all sorts of problems, one of them being abortion. And I just think that this is sort of a statement about the problems that that kind of promiscuousness leads to. So, end of statement.
I think the turning of the wife to salt also indicates, you know, she didn't obey God. She turned around and looked, and she was directed not to look, but she did anyway, and she suffered a punishment as a result. So I just think it sort of emphasizes that, you know, you have to adhere to what God tells you to do. If not, you may have bad consequences.
Unfortunately,
I really,
unfortunately, unfortunately,
One at a time. We're okay.
unfortunately, she didn't have a chance to try again. It wasn't like, oops, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
You know, she's gone. I just,
Mhm. I was
No.
struck by
oh,
the fact that she was turned, or the use of the word salt. And again, this is very probably a little too literal of me, but I was thinking of just other parts in the Bible where, you know, this is where was the salt of the earth and light of the world, and being salt is seems to be like a good thing, a promising thing, and reminding us of our earthiness and how we're, you know, to be, you know, earthy and rugged and grounded in our Christianity. So there it's a good thing, and then here it seems to be a punishment. So I wondered if anyone knew, or Evelyn, if you or anyone else knew of the role that salt plays in this, or if it just happens to be the material that, or if it's just coincidence. But I was struck by that.
On the subject of how many went out, 4 or 6, I'm looking at verse 16. Remember that there were 2 virgin daughters that had lived in Lot's house. He also had sons-in-law, which suggests he had 2 married daughters. The sons-in-law were the ones that thought he was joking. So I would subscribe to the thought that the sons-in-law and his other 2 daughters stayed behind and was destroyed. And then going to verse 16, it said, and while he, Lot, lingered, the men, the angels, took hold of his hand, his wife's hand, and the hands of his 2 daughters, which would have been the 2 virgin daughters that were in his house. So that suggests that the 4 of them, members of the family, dad, mom, and 2 daughters, went out along with Lot's wife. It would not have included the other daughters who were married.
This story is reminding me of there's a point where Christ commissions the 12 in Matthew chapter 10. I'm sorry, I've been looking away for this verse. And Christ commissions the 12, and he says, whatever town or village you enter, find out who is in it that is worthy, and stay there until you leave. As you enter the house, greet it. If the house is worthy, let your peace come upon it. But if it is not worthy, let your peace return to you. And if anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet as you leave the house or town. Truly, I tell you, it is more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that town. There's something that happened there where they did not accept or even recognize the presence of God. There's something that happened there. No wonder what use are your eyes if you could see God and not recognize his presence right before you? No wonder they were struck blind. This notion that they did not receive the great blessing that had come to their town, that they were so blinded by their traditions, their ideas of the way that they wish to live, perhaps their lascivious kind of sexualized culture, that they missed the presence of God. And I think that's the thing for us to really hone in on and take away. I think a lot has been made of this that may be a bit of a stretch. Is this an overt prohibition against homosexuality? Personally, I don't necessarily see that being there. I do see casual sex maybe being judged in this. I do see ritualistic abuse being judged in this. And I certainly see not seeing the full presence of God, not being worshipful, not being set apart, being drawn in by cultural influences that are outside of the spirit of God and the community that God has given you, as being judged in all of this. But to that, this is one of those scriptures that has created a great deal of rankling and cantankerous argument through history and culture. And I tend to want to point to the things that can kind of bring the church together. And this is one of those things that unfortunately has torn us up. So,
Alvin, I think it's worth noting, though, that at the very beginning of the chapter, there were two values that were ascribed to people who were faithful to God. One is righteousness, and the other is justice. And mentioning that the sexuality here wasn't the healthy sexuality, the sacred sexuality of love, of marriage, of commitment, that the church honors, but it was involved the use of force. They were asking for people to come out of the house to be abused, whether they wanted to be abused or not. And yeah, they weren't recognizing them as God because they had their own will in front of them, whether it's cultural or whether it's just blunt force. And it was a posse, So when we look at justice and we look at righteousness, what's served in sexual violence? Neither one of those. It doesn't mention where love and God exists, because God exists inside love. So it might be not so much, it would be a misuse of the term, I think, of this verse to say it's against homosexuality, or something that's going on in your neighbor's bedroom. I think it's more likely that it's the use of force and violence against people who are helpless to get out of it.
Urban life can become bloodless, right? We know this to be true. The notion that you get so caught up in whatever it is that's happening culturally within your city, that the city gets so invested in certain things that it just churns people up almost upon arrival, right? And I see some of that there. You see Lot pleading like, may I still love urban life? This is who I am. May I go to this smaller city? Is that okay? Is this your judgment upon civilization, or is this your judgment upon that specific place? And I tend to see that it is certainly God saying that something was amiss within Sodom and Gomorrah. And I think it was bigger than just the sexual side of it. I think the sexual side of it was just a very vivid way to bring it home to the intended readers. The people who were intended to read this are the Jewish people who are set apart by God. And there was something happening there. There was something that Lot was a part of that wasn't making it clear that he too was set apart. And yet we see God's mercy. God comes specifically for Lot and delivers Lot. And there's that notion that there's no reason to even look back. You got to shake that dust off your sandals. Great urban philosopher Jay-Z once said, get the dust off your shoulders. You got to move on. You know, you gotta move on from a place that would reject the Spirit of God, that could look truth directly in the eye and say, I want no part of it. That's not a very healthy place to be. That's not a very healthy culture to take part in. And there's no bargaining. There was no, Lot couldn't work his way out of it. There was no, giving his betrothed daughters over to that place. No, it was time to go. We've all done that. We've all quit those jobs that we needed to quit.
I very much agree with you, Alvin, in wanting to keep from dividing the body. But it's pretty hard to look at this passage and see that the men in the street wanted the two angels. They pounded on the door. As was pointed out, they were using violence to try to get at them. And if the angels hadn't stopped them, if they'd been ordinary men, they would have had their way. They were in no wise interested in virgin daughters. They rejected them out of hand. They wanted the men. So I think it's very obvious here that it's a homosexual, a carnal sin that is being condemned, and the destruction of Sodom would have to be read, I believe, in that light. That does not denigrate the thought that we are to love the sinners, but hate the sin.
Yeah, I wrestle with that, Bill. I got to tell you, in part because I've known so many people with such real faith, and I just don't know if, for me and my values, if that's fully where this thing is leading itself to. I don't know if I've ever been comfortable personally, and this is my thing, with looking at this story as being a prohibition on homosexual relationships. What I will say is that like I tell many people that are a part of my life who are homosexual, the rules still apply. That God wishes for you to have relationship. That sexuality is not something to be approached casually. That there is something of the way that you approach your sexuality that is a part of your spiritual life as well. This is not just a fun toy for you to just run around with, but this is something of the essence of who you are that you should share with someone in love. But that being said, that this is definitely tradition would hold as you state, and I personally just it's never been comfortable for me. It's never fully equated to the full love of God that I know to be true, that no matter where you are in your life, God is there for you. But it is for everyone as it may be. And yeah, this is one of those things I don't understand. I don't know where you guys stand on it, but
well, I'd like to talk about this just briefly. I think that people are innately homosexual, or they're innately straight, whatever it is. And as to the point you made, Alvin, about sort of licentiousness, I think to some degree our society caused that kind of behavior in people. So when I went to school in New York, there were men going to bathhouses and so forth because our society didn't welcome them to have marriages and all these other kinds of things that we uphold in the straight world. And so I think that we as a society almost prompted that kind of behavior, and saw people as the other, and so people acted as the other. I don't think that is right, but I honestly don't believe that it's a sin. I don't. I mean, I just feel like we know more about the brain and science and all that. People are who they are. And it's just very disappointing to me to see what's happening right now in our society, where these issues with respect to this Roe v. Wade case are now opening the floodgates of where is this going to go now? Are we going to start to see legislation around birth control? These are our bodies. I mean, one thing that I've learned from Dwight, particularly in this church, is this idea of freedom and freedom of your body, freedom of who you are. And so I find that very, very troubling where we're headed as a society, and it worries me a lot. So that's my 2 cents.
Shelley?
Well, these are obviously very big topics. I just think in those days and still today, we in our societies, whether we're Christians or legal scholars or whatever, still attempting to understand and parse out the difference between dominance and abuse and what is sexuality. There is a difference. We're still trying to understand rape. So I don't think they had it understood then, and I don't think we have it understood today. The difference between what appears to be a sexual act, which is really the kinds of things Mary was talking about, which appears to be abuse. And it was clear to me, it seemed to me from this passage that this passage was about who's going to dominate whom, and it was about dominance of the locals versus the aliens. That's my thought.
Rosemary?
I tend to agree with that. It seems to me that the story isn't really about sex at all. I think the story is about people being welcomed. It seems to me that Lot and his family were resident aliens, and they came to live in a society that didn't want them. And so they decided to, it's a power dominance, because rape is a crime of power. It has nothing to do with sex. Rape is nothing to do with sex whatsoever. And so having worked in the prison system for several years, I can tell you that it is a crime of dominance. Someone comes into the system, and in order to survive in the system, they have to learn how to survive. And apparently, Lot's decision was to leave for something better, because where he was not going to be forgiving to him. We have a lot of folks, it seems to me right now, who are resident aliens of one kind or another. And we don't want to absorb these folks into our society. That's how I feel. And I was a rape crisis volunteer for a couple of years, and I can tell you it's a crime of violence and power, and has absolutely nothing to do with sex.
I was a bartender on Capitol Hill for 10 years in Washington, D.C. And I got to tell you guys, I would have a weekly conversation, maybe even a couple times a week, with individuals, explaining to them, you're this person's boss. There is no way this relationship can be consensual. I care about you enough to let you know that now, that when I get a knock on my door from law enforcement, I'm going to have to tell the truth, about who you went home with, and I don't like doing that. I'm your friend, right? I feel that sex itself is beautiful and holy and wonderful. We all know this. Disordered sex is messy and sinful and worthy of judgment. And unfortunately, within our society, there are so many areas where that disorder is there. And this story gives us a beautiful example of people who have the interplay of sex and power and its place in society all out of whack. And to the bigger and broader questions, I mean, I think it's something for each of us to wrestle with individually and corporately. You know, I must say, it's the reason I'm a part of the Episcopal Church. I love that this church has this conversation rather than just resorting back to whatever tradition may hold and simply just wagging fingers. It's instead saying, you know, let's figure this out. And I'm happy to wrestle with all of it with all of you. Yes, Mary.
I was reading an Episcopal theologian in the last year of EFM, and I apologize, I forgot his name. I could look it up if somebody wants me to do that, but I thought it was interesting that when he talked about the sin of sex when it isn't involved in a loving marriage, you know, the definition of marriage is that there are two people and God, and that God is in that. And if you're in a marriage and there isn't God in that, then the marriage is essentially dissolved. And to interfere with that love between people that exists between two human beings, where God is in that, is defined as a crime against the first commandment, or a sin against the first commandment, because you're not seeing God in that. You're not accepting that God is in that. So like to interfere with something that a married couple does, because you think you're more religious than they are, or you think that whatever it is that you're thinking is really you're using a dominance over them, and you're not recognizing that God is love, and that love is inside that couple. And I just found it interesting that it's considered to be a sin against the first commandment, as postulated by this writer, and that this is really basically coming out here in this situation where people are not seeing God. Literally, they're not seeing that these heavenly visitors were heavenly, that God is in them, and that it's not to be messed with.
What did Jesus say? If you enter a place and they don't like you, shake the dust off of your feet and walk.
Matthew 10. Yeah. Dust them off. Oh boy. Yes, Bill. You're beautiful.
Not if they don't like you, Rosemary, if they will not hear the word. And the bottom line in this whole conversation is scripture. It's not whether we like people or dislike people. It's what a Christian worldview would have us do. And I love you, Rosemary. So I love your dog too. I didn't see him today.
Yeah.
He's sleeping.
Well, I think this is a good point for us to take a break and pray. We'll get back together both in person and remotely next week. We've got a few more weeks to go. I'm not sure that we're going to get to Joseph, but I hope to. We can keep digging.
That's another good story.
This deserved some time, and I think ahead of us, we've got Abraham and Isaac and we're going to get to the story of the ram in the bush, and I think that'll be a good place for us to hold on next week, and then we'll move on to Isaac and Rebecca the week after, and see how far we can go. You know, Melchizedek makes another appearance. We got plenty more wonders in this incredibly rich book of Genesis to go through. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for the blessing of being able to come together and study your word. Your word is a lamp unto our feet and a light on our path. And I pray that as we move forward from this day, we do so with full knowledge and courage of your love for each and every one of us, that these stories of humanity falling short and being redeemed and saved by you gives us the courage to give that message that relationship in you is the way to salvation and life. I pray these things in Jesus' name.